Hello, welcome to the Egosia Art Studio. Joining me today is this delicate little lady. This is a female hummingbird, and her jacket is especially pretty because it has this crochet trim and lots of beadwork. So today I'm going to be talking about how I incorporate beadwork into the clothing on my dolls. Let's get started. I use beadwork as a sort of a form of embroidery, and I view my techniques as sort of a variation of embroidery techniques. So let's say that you have some fabric and you're going to put a bead on top of it. I think that the key to having a successful array of beadwork where the bead sits on top of the fabric and the fabric stays nice and flat is having two things. One, you want to have fabric with some body or some reinforcement, and two, the proper stitching technique. So if you're coming along with the thread, what a lot of people will do is they'll come along and they'll come up through the thread and then they'll form a loop that goes through and then come back down sort of like in the middle where the bead is. And what that does is it creates a little shank under here and it allows the bead to move around, and that's not what you want. What you want to do is come up before the bead, and then you go through the bead, and then you want to have some space where the thread kind of sits away from the holes of the bead on either end. And this allows the bead to sink into the fabric and to lay flat and straight against the fabric, which is what you want most of the time. The other thing is that you want to make sure that you do have enough body to that fabric. So either you have to have some kind of lining, or you have to have interfacing, which, if you know me, I don't use that. So usually what I do is either I use a thicker fabric like a wool or a linen, or I'll just add another layer of fabric underneath. So with those things in mind, how do I actually do the beadwork? Nothing complicated. I use either regular sewing thread, doubled, or I use buttonhole twist, which is a polyester thread wrapped with cotton. And so it's thicker, and you can use a single thread of this, and I really like those. In both cases, although especially with the sewing thread, I will run it through a beeswax needle to sort of get some of the twistiness or the springiness out of it, and that's very helpful. What I do not use are quilting threads, 'cause these are 100% cotton, and they're okay, but they can break, and so you can actually just snap it by hand, and you don't want your threads to break over time. That's just kind of sadness. And I also don't use upholstery thread, which is more easily found than the buttonhole twist, but this is 100% nylon. It's thicker also, but it has this weird sort of wiry springiness to it, and I find that it really knots up a lot, and I just don't like it. So most of the time, 99% of the time, I'm either using a light gray or a dark gray. I do not try to match my thread to the fabric or the beads. So I think maybe I'm a little unusual in that case, but you know what? People never say to me, oh my gosh, I can see the thread in your beadwork. It blends right in. The light gray or the dark gray, that's all you need. So don't worry about that so much. So if you remember from my other videos about clothes, I will make a garment and it's fully lined. So here I have a little wool jacket and it's lined with linen, and all of my beadwork is either on the surface or along the edge, and I'll show you that in just a second. So when I'm doing my beadwork, and of course where's my needle? Here it is. I'm just doing stitches right into the surface after the garment is complete. So I will make the garment and then I'll fit it onto the doll and see where it is that I need to do the work. So, if it's not going to show on the underarms, then I'll say, okay, I need to stop a half an inch away from the side or whatever. And then I'll just do the stitching right on here, and I'm feeling underneath to make sure that I don't go through the lining. And some people think, oh my gosh, that's just so hard, how can you do that? It's actually really easy. There's nothing difficult about it at all. And I'm just taking simple back stitches. With little beads like this, it's pretty straightforward. You run into more difficulty with beads moving around when you have the larger beads. So with something like this, I don't worry about how messy any of the thread looks underneath because it's not going to show over here. So remember, I said your fabric has to have some heft to it, some body. So this is wool. This lining for the garment does not count as any kind of underlining for the front of the garment. So if this was lighter weight, then I would have a piece of muslin underneath here or something like that. So I would actually stitch this with 3 layers instead of 2 to give enough body for the beads to sit. Even seed beads like this have weight, and that's something that a lot of people don't realize. So if you have a garment and it's attached to the doll and it's sewn into the doll, it's not so much of a concern. But if this is hanging free, all of these beads mean that this fabric is going to be tugged by gravity. So if there's not enough body to this, then you will have distortion in this fabric along the bias or along one of the grain lines, and you just want to make sure that you avoid that. And so, you know, that's the big key here. One thing where you don't have to worry about that is if you're doing beadwork along the edges. So let's say that you wanted to have a row of beads to highlight an edge, and so I've got a doll here that has layers of vests, and he's got a striped and spotted thing going on, and so I'm just calling attention to those spots by putting these little picots of beadwork along the hem. So this is a lightweight silk twill, and then this is a very lightweight silk lining, and I did not add anything extra inside here because the seam allowances of this garment are acting as the reinforcement for these stitches. So when I do these stitches, I'm doing a back stitch. This is not a big running stitch. And what I would do is I would do this stitch, you know, do this picot here, do another picot, and then I would knot. And then I'd go along, do a picot, do another picot, and then knot. So when you have a long line along an edge like this where potentially it could catch, it's a good idea to knot every few stitches. When you're doing something on the body of a garment like this, you don't have to worry about that so much. But, you know, you can if you want to. It's just, this is much less likely to catch on something than something like this here. So remember when I told you that you want to have that thread well away from the edge of the beads. What happens if you come up and a bead underneath the middle and then you make a loop through and then you come back down? Well, it forms a shank. And the one place where that can be useful, and so you can kind of see it here, this is the nice thick buttonhole twist. One area where this can be useful is that if you do want to use a bead as a button, which we have here, because it gives some place for this fabric to fit underneath and around that bead. So that's one place where it would be useful. Now when I'm doing something with larger beads like this, I would sew in this bead, make a knot, sew in this bead, make a knot, sew in this bead, and so on and so forth. Just because these are heavier beads, and that knot just helps the weight be distributed in this particular garment. Although this is a little bit different from a sewn garment. This is thick crochet, so this has quite a bit of heft to begin with. But you know, I'm not really worrying too much about whether or not the thread is going to go through here or be seen, because this is going to stay buttoned up, and you know, that looks fine. So that is my simple Agosia Arts method of beadwork. Nothing fancy. I'm sure you can find better videos somewhere on YouTube than what I've got here, but just in case you wanted to know how I was doing it, that's what we've got going on. So I hope this was useful or fun. Let me know if it was helpful to you and what you thought, and see you next time. Bye-bye.